Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, March 4th, 2010. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, we take a look at the results of the third Brew Your Own Magazine Basic Brewing Radio collaborative experiment. How to extract beers that were brewed at full volume boil, partial boil, and partial boil with a portion of the extract added late compare in bitterness and color. We'll have lab results and feedback from you to compare. If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. You can follow me on Twitter at Basic Brewing, all one word. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james. And our Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing Video page on Facebook is at facebook.com/basicbrewing. Thanks to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you this show, and we appreciate your support. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own Magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site, too. This is a long show this week. We got a lot to cover, so let's just jump right into it. Well, we have a whole bunch of guys here on the line and in the house. I'm just going to call a roll. Here in the studio are Steve Wilkes.
Hello, hello, hello.
Andy Sparks.
Hello.
And via the intranets, we have Chris Colby.
Hello.
And Brad Sturgeon.
Hello there.
And Blake Lyon.
Hey, what's going on?
The only one with an original line.
Well, we've been doing our little sampling early here, so if we're goofy right off the bat, that's the explanation. We are here to evaluate the third collaborative experiment between Brew Your Own Magazine and Basic Brewing Radio. Chris, do you want to talk about the parameters of the experiment?
Yeah, the experiment is designed to test the difference between different extract homebrewing methods on hop character in homebrew. Specifically, we picked a very hoppy beer recipe, a double IPA recipe, to be brewed first of all with a full wort boil, where you start off with a greater volume than your actual volume of beer is, and boil it down to that volume. Secondarily, brewing the beer with sort of what you might think of as the standard method of homebrew that we all started with, where you start with stirring all your extract into a concentrated boil that, and then add water at the end to make up your batch volume. And the third way, a slight variant on that is just what sometimes is called the extract late version, where you withhold some of the malt extract and only stir it into the boil, into a concentrated boil towards the end.
And there are some assumptions that we make or have grown to make over time over these different methods, right? I mean, the full wort boil is supposed to give you the best volume and moderate density, allegedly affecting hop bitterness, right? And then the partial boil with extract added at the beginning is supposed to be the worst of both worlds. You have a dense, small volume of wort. And then the third one, the extract light method, is supposed to combat that by, if you've got a partial boil, you wait and add your extract at the end. So what we have done is I have done it here, this recipe, this super hoppy, wonderful recipe that you made, and I've done a full boil, a partial boil with all the extract added at the beginning, and a partial boil with half of the extract added at the end. And we have tasted those samples randomly arranged here in the studio, and let's talk about what we've perceived.
Basically, when we got started, the very first one, my plan was to go through and give each one a good sniff and kind of judge their aroma character, and then go back and do a taste character, and just kind of go through them and do one step at a time. First thing I did was took a big sniff of the first one. Very hoppy, lots of citrus aroma. Then I grabbed the second one, took a big sniff, and I couldn't hardly smell anything really, and I didn't find it to be as aromatic. So I took a good sniff of the next one, the last one, and same sort of thing. I was kind of disappointed. I felt like, wow, the first one was very hoppy and the other two weren't. So I went back and took a sniff of the first one again, and it smelled more like the last two. So I'm afraid that that just shows me that very, very aromatically bright beers tend to be one of those things that you can only sniff so many times before you lose the ability to really, pull those things out.
Your olfactory sense was saturated, right?
Yeah,
away.
right.
So, and again, these were randomly assigned or randomly ordered.
Right. So we don't know which one of the
right
of the
and we still don't know.
No, we don't. But I would agree with Andy. Except now I'll take it into taste. In that the first beer that I tasted, our number one, had the biggest hop nose and, to me, the biggest hop flavor. I mean, it just blew me away. And then progressively down the scale from number 2 to number 3, each one has somewhat less character to it, to me. And I still feel that way now that they've warmed up a little bit.
And you've gone the other way, I guess.
I've gone back and forth all around the merry-go-round.
Well, my impressions, I thought number 2 was kind of the most most sharply bitter. And I mean, the differences between each of these was extremely minute. And the number 3, I thought it had the most mouthfeel and kind of a better overall hop flavor. Kind of a more roundish hop flavor, bitterness, and aroma. Now, the head retention here was pretty much equal, and number 3 appeared half a shade darker.
Yeah,
not very much at all. So should we unveil? Are you ready to?
Yeah, I would just say that I would agree with you that number 3 seemed to be the most balanced of the 3 beers to me.
Okay,
and I think you'd probably say that too.
I kind of liked one.
Really?
Well, I liked one, but that doesn't mean I thought it was the most balanced.
Yeah. 2 was the one I thought was the kind of the middle of the road of the 3. I thought the other 2 were the extremes.
Okay. All right. So what we have here, number 1 was the partial boil with extract added at the beginning. Number 2 was the partial boil with half the extract added at the end. And number 3 was the full wort boil with the extract added at the beginning. I've been living with these beers and sampling on them every now and then, so that probably gave me an edge on maybe picking out some of those characteristics. But again, the differences between those very, very slight. Now let's talk about the process a little bit. Let's go into some details on these that I didn't want to reveal beforehand. First of all, in the full boil, the pre-boil gravity was 1068. Okay? The pre-boil gravity on the partial boil was 1.127. So that's some syrupy stuff for the hops to be utilized through. And then the partial boil late extract, since only half the extract was added at the beginning, it started off the boil at 1077. Now, one thing that I ran into when I came to rack out of the kettle was that there was a whole lot of hop debris in the bottom. And so a fair amount of wort was left in the kettle. So not so much of an impact on the full boil, full volume boil, but when it got to the other 2, the gravity of that wort that was left in the kettle was twice as high as the full boil. And so when I topped off to get equal volume, the starting gravity of each beer was markedly different. For instance, the full boil started off at 1076, original gravity. The partial boil started off at 1070, and then the partial boil late extract, for some reason, was 1066. So there are three different beers as far as the amount of alcohol is concerned. Now, we have the luxury of having our good buddy Brad up at Monmouth College. Brad and Blake up there helped us out with some scientific analysis, not just our dull taste buds. Right, Brad?
When I let Blake did all this work, I just kind of pretended like I'm going to take the credit for it. But I'll let Blake tell you about that.
Well, for the full boil, we got an IBU of 66. And me and Brad were both kind of shocked we got two partial boils. The first partial boil had an IBU of 61, and the partial boil with the late addition of the extract had an IBU of 57. So surprisingly, they're all like fairly close together.
I did a little figuring that blew me away as well, because I thought I was thinking the partial boil extract late added was going to be up there with the full boil, and that the partial boil extract early was going to be really hampered. But I was thinking about the difference between these three, and when you remember that the starting gravity of each of these was different. So what I did was I divided the bitterness units by the starting gravity of each of these. And what I came out with was the same number.
Wow.
So the ratio of the bitterness units to the starting gravity was the same in each beer. So if my logic is correct, the hop utilization in each of these beers was the same, right?
That's what it looked like.
That's pretty surprising. So what do you think, Chris?
I think we've just wrecked brewing science.
Pretty much.
Cheers to that. Let's do some more.
Yeah, James and I had talked about the BU to GU ratios that he had calculated, and I went and looked at the numbers in a slightly different fashion. I just took the the starting gravity of the forward boil one and calculated what percentage strength were the other ones. And what I found out was that I don't remember the numbers exactly, but the second one was maybe 92% as strong, in terms of OG,
right,
to the original one. And if you calculated the amount of IBUs, it had 92% as much IBUs. And the same thing for the third one. It was 86% or whatever the number was percent, as dense as the first one, and the 86% of the IBUs. So indicating that whatever difference in IBUs were just different, were just due to the difference in how much, water had been added, or looked at another way, how much wort was lost in the debris at the bottom of the kettle.
Right.
So yeah, it really looks like that all these beers James got the same hop utilization using three different methods, when we would expect from what standard brewing science tells us that they should have been very, very different.
And to give a picture, and people can, the only difference that I had with your recipe that's posted on your blog was that I did all light dry malt extract instead of doing a partial mash. But we had hops added at 60 minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, 5 minutes, flame out, and dry hopping. So, it was hopped all the way through the process. And I just find it shocking that there was no difference at all in hop utilization, especially because the starting gravity of the partial wort boil was just so darn syrupy and thick.
Right. It should have, if standard brewing science is correct, it should have suffered on two accounts. You were boiling a very thick boil, and then when you were done, you were diluting it to twice as dilute.
Right.
And so that there should have been less hop utilization with a thick wort, and then you would dilute that already thick wort, or dilute the thick wort that didn't have as many IBUs by 2, and that seems puzzling that they came out all to very closely the same BUG ratio.
Can I ask a question as the least scientific person here? If you were to scale this up to 5 gallons or 10 gallons or a barrel, would it change the dynamics? Would it change what we're talking about?
Brad, you want to tackle that?
Well, I guess the only thing I would say is assuming you could have the same sort of rate of boiling, right? With a larger boil or a larger volume, you're going to have a harder time getting sort of a more rolling boil. It will probably be better for your hop utilization. So, I don't know. I think that's the only thing I can think of right off the top of the bat.
So how vigorous the boil is might make a difference in the utilization.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've been thinking of maybe trying to do an experiment where we sort of measure the actual gradient in the temperature across the beer. And towards the bottom, it's probably actually higher than the boiling point. You've got 5 gallons or 10 gallons sitting on top of that. So just like a scuba diver underwater feels a lot greater pressure, you probably have a little bit of a higher temperature on the bottom than on the top and on the side. So, that may be a small difference that may or may not play out in some sort of IBU.
Now, along with the bitterness factor, one reason for adding extract at the end of the boil is to avoid darkening of the wort. So, Blake, what did you find out about the color?
Actually, for the first two, the full boil and the partial, the color was pretty much about the same. As me and Brad were talking with the caramelization, the partial with the extract added late came out to be a little lower than the other two, SRM-wise. So, what are the numbers? So we got about 12.5 for the full boil, 12.2 for the partial, and about 10.2 for the late extract.
So there may be a reason if you are brewing an extremely light beer, if you want to avoid wort darkening, then that would be, as far as our research is so far, the most legitimate reason to add the extract or a portion of the extract at the end of the boil or near the end of the boil.
Yeah, it's almost really hard to tell just by looking at them, though. The numbers are a little easier to look at than just looking at the beers individually because they are all actually very close.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we had a hard time discerning the difference just
well,
from looking
at
them.
Well, I think my beers, as they sit in my beakers right now, are a lot different in color because we're getting some of the trube at the bottom there. So
it's interesting, just our section of it, but we have 13 other people, other brewers from around the world who have chimed in on this as well.
A baker's dozen.
That's right. So is there anything else that we should mention about this particular beer, the one that I made, before we move on to reading others' experiences with the experiment?
Is there any left?
Yeah, there's
as a matter of fact
3 full ones right there.
What do we want?
What did people think in terms of overall quality? I thought, given knowing ahead of time even that these were brewed 3 different extract methods, I thought they all basically smelled, basically taste, and basically looked the same. There was some small difference, but I was really kind of shocked at how similar they were.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, I think we all reached the same conclusion. We all, I think, kind of forced to pick one that we liked best, but they were a push, really.
Yeah, and if I hadn't, like I said, been living with these beers for so long, I don't think that I would have had any perceptions of difference between the 3. So,
Hey, James, can I add one little bit of info here?
Sure thing.
So one of the things we should probably be aware of in the partial boils, if the final beers are coming out at about 60 IBU, the 61 and 57, that would imply, and I can't see any reason scientifically not to believe it, that half volume attained an IBU of about 120, which I think is sort of the top end for solubility of the isomerized alpha acids. It might be an interesting redo in some cases if that full boil was hopped to the point where you might project an IBU of, say, 100, which would mean that in the partial boils you probably get an IBU of probably something along 120, since that seems to be, at least from what I understand, the maximum solubility. And then we might see a different concentration just by the dilution there, and then we would see a difference.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we had talked about Chris having a round of this experiment, and instead of having the problem with racking the wort away from all the hop tube, is to pour the whole thing into the fermenter as well. So, I mean, we'd be adding two variables to the experiment doing that, but maybe that's something to try too. Is just blowing the top out of the bitterness scale and seeing what happens.
Yep.
Leaving tooth enamel be damned. So let's run through quickly these submissions, and man, the amount of detail that people put into these submissions is just incredible, and that I'm assuming that will be really useful to you, Chris, for writing the article, more for reading here since we have limited time. But let's just go through these, and I've got sort of a tally at the end. Tim Harris, let's start with Tim from Silverdale, Washington, did an American IPA. Said he conducted all three methods, full wort boil, partial boil, and extract late. He began with a recipe from Jamil and John's Brewing Classic Styles book called Hoppiness is an IPA. He says he was pressed for time and couldn't get any Munich malt extract, so he opted for partial mash. Concerned about consistency issues from grain ratios and separate mini mashes, he conducted one mash for all three batches. So he did one mash and split them. So it seems like a really good idea. Yep. He said it seemed weird to be resorting to partial boil and extract late techniques for such small batches. So his gravities, he got pretty close. There's only like one point between. He did the same experiment that I did, full wort, partial boil, and extract late. He said, for the tasting, I gathered 5 friends who were craft beer drinkers, 4 of whom are homebrewers. Each person got 2 bottles each of the beer and 3 cups labeled to match. Explained that the beers were brewed as part of the brewing process experiment, but no specifics were given. Each person received a tasting card for each of the 3 beers in order to take notes. Prompts were pre-written on the cards for color, foam, aroma, flavor, bitterness, and other observations. So he really had things going on here. He said the darkest in color was unanimously the partial boil. The full wort and extract late were fairly close, with the extract late getting one more vote for darkest, which is interesting. 4 of 5 tasters felt like the full wort beer had the most hop aroma. 3 out of 5 reported that the extract late had the least hop aroma. All tasters reported similar malt aroma in all 3 beers, although one taster reported more caramely aroma in the partial boil beer. Flavor. While each taster was an experienced craft beer drinker, most had little experience in actual tasting and analysis. It was difficult to get any flavor observations from the listeners beyond hop components or flavor. When prompted, nobody reported any sweetness that was not balanced by hop flavor and bitterness. Likewise, there were no dominant malt flavors reported. The extract late beer received unanimous credit for being the most bitterness up front, followed by the full wort and then the partial boil. Both the extract late and full wort beers were about even as far as lingering bitterness, but one person said the extract late beer left a harsh hop bitterness long after tasting. So I got that kind of harsher bitterness from the extract late beer. It's kind of a one-dimensional, harsher, but again, very, very subtle. All five tasters stated that they would be repeat customers for any of the three IPAs. More specifically, they could drink any of these all day long and would order more the next time I was in. So when it came to straight-up bitterness, it would appear that the partial boil batch experienced the worst utilization and the extract late beer had the best. So, but again, the lab results don't bear that out. I just wonder if there's some different kinds of bitterness being extracted from the hops. You know what I'm saying? Whereas on paper, it looks the same bitterness, but maybe different hop components are being pulled out to give some different perceptions. I don't know. Adam Greatencord from Austin, Texas. It did a partial mash IPA. He had different starting gravities because he had a boil over on his extract late version. Typical Cascade aroma, floral, citrusy, more floral character on the full and partial boil, although the late was a bit stronger overall. Bitterness stayed on the palate for all three from start to finish. Kind of an oily taste. Late was the most bitter, and standard the least.
That's two people that thought the extract late was the most bitter.
David Curtis from Kalamazoo, Michigan, IPA. He says it was intended to be a double IPA, but the gravity ended up a bit low. Followed Chris Colby's recommended recipe exactly, except did not use Vienna malt and changed 5-minute Cascade hop addition to 3 minutes. He did two batches. Batch 1 standard method got the entire extract and sugar addition at the beginning of the boil, while batch 2 got only 1 pound and 5 ounces at the beginning of the boil. Little to no color differences. He says the aroma of batch 1 has a very slight touch of diacetyl. That is the full wort boil. Both have very firm bitterness, but batch 2 is definitely sharper, crisper. So
batch 2 was the extract late?
Right. Even though the fermentation temperatures were kept identical, batch 1 appears to have a diacetyl character when batch 2 has none. The difference between the two is very slight. The differences between the two batches are almost negligible. I really had to search, but batch 1 definitely has a bit more sweetness than 2. So again, so the extract late had a bit of a sharper bitterness, but was very, very slight, he said. Halvor Dalaker from Trondheim, Norway. And I apologize for probably mispronouncing your name. American IPA, all extract. He says, for each batch I used 666 grams of Munton's Light DME. I'm not a Satanist, but 2 kilograms divided into 3 batches gives 666.
That's awesome. Hopefully he was listening to some Norwegian black metal while he was...
He says, with the small volumes, a lot of extract was lost in the massive amounts of hops. So, similar experience to me. Hence the differences in the OG readings. So, the starting gravity of the full boil was 1090, the partial boil was 1072, and the partial boil extract late was 1074. So, you see, it's the same issue I had. He says the full boil beer is definitely more bitter than the other two, perhaps also a bit of harsher kind of bitterness. I wonder if this is just an effect of there being so damned many IBUs, he says. From my results, the extract late method does not seem to have much of an effect, but the partial boil methods definitely yields less bitterness than the full boil. So there's a vote for the a vote for the full boil as the more bitter. Trent Hullum from Waco, Texas, did a half partial boil and the full boil. He said the partial was slightly darker. The full boil seems to be a bit more bitter, seems to have more hop character, tastes the same other than that. So Trent was concise in his descriptions.
Brevity is the soul of wit.
Tony Milner from Wallasey, United Kingdom. He also did a double IPA. He did the full wort boil as suggested, the partial boil as suggested, and then rather than the suggested extract late method, I did a full volume boil. He essentially did an extract late with the full volume boil. He says that the full wort boil was the darkest. The partial boil was barely perceptibly lighter, and then the extract late was noticeably lighter. He says that the extract late was the most bitter and the least favorite of all three. So he says, thanks for suggesting the idea. It was fun, and the recipe is a good one. So kudos to Chris.
So he did his extract late, though, was a full wort boil with extract late.
Right. And
then he got it just rippingly.
Yeah, he said it was more bitter and a bit too harsh for him. John Greener from Nampa, Idaho, did a double IPA. He did all three of the methods, and he used homegrown Cascade hops, which is cool. He also did the trick of doing the steeping, and then in one container and splitting it between the three batches. And his gravity, the full wort boil was 1076, partial boil was 1068, and late extract was also 1068. So he again had the same issue that I did.
Very similar to yours.
Color of all three beers was close, with just a shade of difference. The full wort boil was the darkest and had a little tinge of red to its color. The standard methods was late, in other words, the partial boil was next, and the late addition was the lightest. It was agreed upon by his tasters that the full wort boil method had provided the most pungent aroma of the three, but we could not determine which of the other two were next in line. Bitterness seems to be the name of this game. Bitterness did not appear different in character, just in intensity. Most bitter was the full wort boil, followed by the partial wort boil, and running last was the late extract. So he got opposite from everybody else.
Yeah.
He says, thanks, James, for helping my wife pick out the refractometer for my Christmas present. So we are a full-service podcast.
Where the rubber meets the road.
So to speak.
If you will.
As you were. Brian Rout from Saline, Michigan, did the recipe, the IPA recipe. He added sugar and extract to the extract late brew and checked the gravity with a refractometer to ensure that the boil gravity of the extract late brew exactly matched the full boil batch. So he had the same starting gravities. He says no discernible differences in color, no discernible differences in clarity, could not distinguish any hop-derived differences in the beers. Other than the differences in initial foam and head retention, I could not distinguish between the three batches. The only difference was visual. So,
wow.
Jerry Morawski from Oak Creek, Wisconsin. He's the Field Point Brewery. Follow him on Twitter. He did the full wort boil and then the partial wort boil. So he says after the whirlpool, almost all the hop material transferred over to the fermenter. So he said to heck with it, and he just, he rather than leave that thick wort behind in the kettle, he just put it all, trub and all, into the fermenter. So he says that the the partial boil was just a tad darker than the full wort boil, although the color difference was slight. Full wort boil. Aroma suggests hops, but not as strongly as I had anticipated. Hop forwardness in the taste. He said, to summarize, he says, there is a difference between the two methods. My preference is for the partial boil over the full wort boil and seems to contradict what should have been expected. We've all heard that the larger boil volumes enables more hop utilization, lighter color, etc., with smaller boil volumes having the opposite effect. Here's my take on why. He says, he essentially, and forgive me, Jerry, for summarizing, but he essentially says that he thinks the reason that he preferred the hop character of the partial boil was the fact that he put all that hop trube over into the fermenter. And he said he used to do that. You know, in the beginning when he brewed, he would just pour all of the contents of the kettle in the fermenter.
Yeah.
And he stopped doing that, but he says he may go back to doing that now because he liked the character of the beer. He says, my personal conclusion is this. Perhaps I don't have to be so concerned about what gets transferred from the brew kettle into the fermenter. In fact, for this particular style of beer, I believe it's preferential to transfer the whole kit and caboodle from the kettle to the fermenter. The partial boil beer obviously had a bunch more hops in contact with the wort longer than the full wort beer. If hop character is what you're after, then this might be the way to go. So, there you go. So he liked the partial boil better. And he didn't do the late extract. Keith and Trent from Waco, Texas. They also did the IPA. A full boil and a partial boil. Both batches have a dark bronze color. The partial boil appears only slightly darker than the full boil batch. Aroma is identical to me. Partial boil, only ever so slightly more bitter. Full boil, slightly sweeter. There does appear to be a difference when hopping a split batch. At least in my experiment, it's not markedly different, and probably only enough to tell a difference if side by side. He says, fun experiment, and I get to enjoy the final product. So he says it's inconsequential, essentially. Easy for me to say.
No, it wasn't.
No, you're right. Okay, Ron Evans from Verdigris, Oklahoma. English Imperial IPA. Both beers made at the same time. Started both boils with 3 gallons total, one with all the extract and one with 1/8 of the total extract. He essentially says the high gravity boil, in other words, the partial, or he did all of the extract versus extract light. So he said all the extract was darker, essentially. At all stages of the process, the low gravity boil beer was lighter. This was most pronounced prior to the boil. Then color appeared only slightly different at the final tasting, so only slightly different with the color. Yeah. The low-gravity boil beer, in other words, the extract light beer, had a more harsh and more tart flavor. It made me wince when I took the first drink like you might biting into a lemon. The low-gravity boil beer is more bitter, but not dramatically so, and the bitterness is more harsh. So, again... Oh, he says his wife, who drinks Budweiser, Killian's Red, and margaritas, says, don't like it. Which is what my wife would have said.
Yeah.
He said he prefers the high-gravity boil beer. The low-gravity boil beer had much better foam characteristics and less darkening, but more harsh hop flavors. So, again, he started with 1/8 of the extract for that one. So it seems to me that... a recurring, if not unanimous, theme is that doing lower gravity boils brings out more harsh hop characteristics. And then Ricky Klein, who we met here in town, did 4 batches. He basically did full volume boil, extract early and extract late, and half volume boil, extract early and extract late. And to boil that down, so to speak, he said that the differences between the samples were minute and not consistently perceived by his team of tasters there. They did a blind tasting. The half-volume batch with the normal DME addition had the least perceived hop aroma and bitterness, which was expected. But he says that his conclusions were, don't worry if you have to do a half-boil because of space or equipment constraints, but don't try to eke every last isomerized alpha acid out of your hops by holding off on the extract. The resulting beer seems to be inferior. So, again, kind of a vote against the extract late method for that style of beer. And then David Blakey from Southampton, Hampshire in the UK, did an English bitter. And he kind of took his own spin on the whole thing by doing an experiment with adding hops at the traditional time, at the beginning of the boil, and then all of his hops at the end of the boil. And he said the 60-minute boil imparts a more complex, interesting, richer, exotic, intense hop flavor to the beer. So he, again, this is not exactly along the lines of our experience or experiment, but he did say that essentially it's better to boil the hops for the prescribed amount of time. So I, at the end of this monologue, I did a little tallying on bitterness. The full wort boil got 3 votes for being the most bitter. Okay. Partial boil got 2. Mm-hmm. Partial boil extract late got 5. And then no preference, 2.
Okay.
So, by a narrow margin, partial boil extract late got the nod there. And then on the darkest color, full wort boil got 4. Partial boil got 4. And then no difference got 3 as far as being the darkest.
Right.
So, really, again, in the anecdotal evidence, it was all over the map as well.
Yeah.
The only kind of recurring theme was that the extract late method gave more of kind of a slightly harsher bitterness than the other methods.
Well, one of the things that strikes me about all of the comments that were made is that I didn't hear anyone say that any of the beers were bad.
Yeah.
And, as a home brewer, I'm not necessarily interested in exactly replicating a beer from batch to batch. Now, yeah, I want it to be, within the same ballpark. Mm. But, the 3 beers that you made tonight, they were all very good. I thought that they were all a little bit different, although it's hard to describe the difference, but they did have some difference between the 3. Mm-hmm. I thought the full boil one was my favorite. I don't think that's what Andy got. But they were all good beers, and so my conclusion from this is play with your beer. I mean, really. I mean, I'm being serious, even though it says I'm being flip.
Right.
That everybody's going to come up with a flavor characteristic that they like the best, and that from these different parameters, none of this seems bad, even though all of them seem slightly different.
One thing that struck me in the overall, listening to all the different people is when you took just the ones that did pretty much the experiment as we envisioned it, and the people who had a tasting panel and didn't tell the people what the experiment was about, so there was no opportunity for preconceived ideas to get in the way. The overall message seemed to be that the beers were all pretty similar. I mean, people detected a little extra harshness in the extract late, but given essentially our the model that we thought it was going to be was that the full wort boil, since it wasn't diluted by half or by twice as much, we kind of expected that to be almost twice as bitter as the other 2. That the partial boil would be very less bitter compared to the full wort boil, and the partial boil with the extract late would be somewhere in the middle. But for multiple people to come up with the idea or to come up with the results that all the 3 beers were fairly similar, with small differences, that really stood out for me. That the sort of the standard model of what we perceived, or what we expected to get. Nobody really got that. There was one guy who sort of said that the full wort boil was a little bit more bitter than the rest, but not really. There was no like sort of stunning, nobody got a data set that showed a real confirmation of the standard model, and everyone seemed to get a data set that indicated that there really wasn't a lot of difference, and especially the people who gave the most details, and like the first guy that had the tasting panel and the cards, and seemed to be very organized. His results seemed to match up very, very closely to ours, and so did the other couple that had the brewed all three, and didn't go off on their own tangent.
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of learning that I've had through this whole experience was the fact that since you're boiling a dense wort, and if you've got a bunch of hop trub, your starting gravity may suffer, and you may leave more sweetness behind in the kettle because of that. I mean, that seems to be the biggest thing that I can think of. And maybe we follow Jerry's example of putting the whole thing in the fermenter.
Yeah, it's not the density of the wort or the fact that you dilute it. It's just that you've left some IBUs behind in the along with the trub and the debris,
and some gravity points in there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the numbers here. I'm thinking that, it just kind of shows how difficult it really can be for us to really have a hard and fast scientific test here, because these subtle variations, like the three beers James has here, there's almost a 10-point swing in the bottles, right? So if we were tasting that, we didn't have a lab to tell us that there was those points, we would definitely think one was bitter. And I think we tasted them and thought the one that says that was 66 was the most bitter of them.
Yeah.
So, it means it's going to be difficult for people that are just tasting samples and don't have the benefit of saying, okay, now I've tasted them, now let me see what they really are. And since they weren't exactly the same, are you perceiving this little this imbalance in the experiment? Because one was a little sweeter, to start with, higher gravity. I don't know. It makes it really tough.
Yeah.
I think it's an eye opener for sure. I also think that the color thing seems to be pretty much what we expected. You can throw out some of the highs and lows, and it looks like, if you boil all the extract for 60 minutes, it's the darkest. Right. If you boil the, you would expect basically the partial to be almost the same, and they probably were almost. Mm-hmm. And then the lightest one would be the partial with extract late. But it seemed to be the one that gave us the kind of more harsh bitterness. At least that seemed anecdotally.
Yeah.
So it would tell you that if you're doing a really hoppy beer, it's maybe not the way to go. But if you're doing a very light beer that isn't have a pronounced hop bitterness, it may be exactly the way to go, like a Pilsner or something.
Mm-hmm. Side by side, I can detect some differences. I'm not sure if you poured me one of these tonight, one tomorrow night, and one the next night, that I could tell you that I was not drinking the same batch of beer.
Right.
I'm not sure I could do that.
And one was not worse than the other.
No, they were all really tasty beers too, by the way.
Well, now our challenge is, I guess, if you guys will accept it, is to maybe take another run at it, Chris, and have you change the experiment parameters a bit, and then maybe send some more samples up to Brad before the article's written in the magazine.
What I'm going to do is brew 3 batches of beer. Full wort boil, partial boil with all the extract added at the beginning, and partial boil with extract late. And what I'm going to do to counteract the effect of losing, both gravity points and BUs in the trub is once the wort is cooled, I'll rack it over to the fermenter, and in the case of the partial boils, add water to dilute the wort to the starting volume, but what I'll do is let it sit in there for a couple hours, let all that stuff sediment out, and then rack to a clean fermenter. with the idea that once you've diluted the wort to working strength, the wort's at the right, it'll be at the right gravity, it'll be at the right, sort of BU-GU ratio. And then, after that point, if you rack it, if you leave some of the trub behind, it's not going to matter at that point, because that's going to be, you've taken care of the variables you need. And so, yeah, I might go with a slightly more bittering hops in front, just to try to see, if we can push up the overall IBUs and if that changes anything. And I'm also going to just bottle off some of the wort, boil off some of the wort at the full boil stage right at the end. Or package off some of the wort in the partial boil and the partial boil with extract late. So there'll be, 2 different densities of wort, and see if the concentrated wort really does have twice as many IBUs as the full wort. So that should be, interesting. And if it falls in line with what we've seen here, then I think we've got a really interesting set of results, and one that certainly, challenges the sort of what common wisdom or whatever you call it of what we've all learned about brewing from the books we've read in the past. And if so, that's a really interesting result.
And it would also be really cool to see the effects of fermentation on bitterness levels. If you can measure the bitterness of the unfermented wort and then measure the bitterness of the beer after fermentation,
right? That'd
be cool as well.
Because one thing they always say is that a certain amount of IBUs get scrubbed out during fermentation. So if we have wort and finished beer from each batch, we'll be able to tell that too, which will be a nice set of results.
Yeah, and one of the things about the analysis of those samples is that there really is no accepted ASBC, the American Society of Brewing Chemists, method for analyzing IBUs in wort. But I don't see any reason why we can't carry out the same extraction procedure. So we're kind of going into uncharted waters, but I really don't see any reason why we couldn't use the same method.
Cool.
Sure, it's if I recall, it's a photographic or spectrophotometer based method.
Yeah, we'll call it that.
A spectrophotometer.
But it's the same test that is used industry wide to measure IBUs, right?
Yeah,
a method that's a lot easier to pronounce before 3 double IPAs.
Most things are.
Right, spectrophotometer, and technically it's a UV visible spectrophotometer. So,
well, guys, this has been extremely exciting, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so we'll have to get together again once you get those samples sent off, and have another round of at least a local experiment to kind of follow up. I appreciate everybody's time and work and enthusiasm.
I'm always enthusiastic when you brew.
Well, until the next time, guys, thanks. I want to thank Chris Colby, editor of Brew Your Own magazine, Brad Sturgeon and Blake Lyon from Monmouth College, Andy Sparks of thehomebrewery.com, and Steve Wilkes of here, I guess, basically, this podcast. Also, a tremendous amount of thanks goes out to everybody who took the time to conduct the experiment, evaluate the results, and send in your data with so much care and detail. And I'm looking forward to the next round that Chris will brew up to see if the lab tests produce similar results. Also, whether we perceive any difference in the hop character, even if the lab says the bitterness units are the same. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Our 2010 Brewers logbooks are still available. And along with our Reinheitsgebot is a 4-letter word shirts as well. Check out our homebrewing DVDs, Introduction to Extract Homebrewing, Stepping into All-Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits as well. Got combo deals on our site to save you a few bucks. And you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Busiest Firefighters Ever, a little golden book. Man, I miss reading those with my kids. They're into Harry Potter now, not golden books. And Garmin Portable Friction Mount. Thanks again, everybody. Remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We appreciate your support. And don't forget that you can also join the American Homebrewers Association through the associate link on basicbrewing.com, as well as subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.